Hello, I'm Leslie Enane. I am an assistant professor of pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine, and I do research with IDEA East Africa. The title for my talk is The Cascade from Trauma to Disengagement Among Adolescents Living with HIV in Western Kenya. There are an estimated 1.7 million adolescents living with HIV globally, of whom 110,000 are living in Kenya. Adolescents experience poor retention in HIV care as compared to other groups, though there are limited data on the factors underlying disengagement. A growing body of literature has examined the intersection of trauma and HIV risk, as well as HIV treatment outcomes in other populations, particularly among adult women who are living with HIV. There are limited studies, however, of trauma among adolescents who are living with HIV. We sought to examine the burden of trauma among adolescents who had disengaged from HIV care and to investigate a potential role for trauma underlying disengagement. Because we sought to understand the processes by which trauma may possibly relate to disengagement from care, we took a qualitative approach. We performed in-depth qualitative interviews with adolescents living with HIV who had disengaged from care at 2 empath sites in Kenya, which were in Eldoret and Kitale, their caregivers, and also healthcare workers at 10 empath sites. Interviews were performed from October 2018 until March 2020. Disengaged adolescents were recruited from the ACE cohort to this study, and disengagement was defined as not attending clinic for at least 60 days past a missed scheduled visit, and adolescents and caregivers were traced through phone calls and home visits. Interviews ascertained barriers and facilitators to retention using the adapted social ecological model, which you see here. Dedicated questions elicited narratives surrounding trauma and the ways in which traumatic experiences did or did not contribute to disengagement. And a conceptual model emerged through a thematic analysis for the convergence of factors from trauma to disengagement from care. Interviews were conducted with 42 disengaged adolescents, 34 of their caregivers, and 28 healthcare workers. We found that there were high burdens of a range of forms of trauma, and these included experiences at HIV diagnosis or disclosure, loss of parents, enacted stigma, and physical or sexual violence. Through reading and rereading of narratives in this study, we found that there was a confluence of intersecting factors relating to trauma, stigma and isolation, and lack of social support. These compounded each other and led to hopelessness, depression, and ultimately disengagement from care. In our interviews with healthcare workers, we found that they took approaches to adolescents with trauma that aligned with factors in this model and that suggested that these areas represent important targets for potential multi-level interventions and provision of trauma-informed care. In particular, we found that peer interventions have the potential to address multiple factors in this cascade. We found that trauma is a major factor underlying disengagement from HIV care among Kenyan adolescents. And we described a cascade of factors representing areas for intervention to support mental health and retention and care. These include not only the provision of mental health care, but also preventing or addressing violence, trauma, and stigma, and reinforcing social and family support surrounding vulnerable adolescents. In this conceptualization, supporting retention and care requires a trauma-informed approach, both in the individualized care of adolescents and in the development of strategies and policies to support adolescent health outcomes. I want to acknowledge and thank the adolescents, caregivers, and healthcare workers who participated in this research, as well as the NIH for the funding for this research, and all members of the study team. And thank you very much.